"We've decided. This is where the parking for my new car will go," my son said, pointing at my roses. "Mom, you have to be practical." I didn't say a word. I just looked at the bushes, the deep red ones, the ones Richard and I had planted together 20 years ago. Their scent was the first thing that greeted me every morning. His memory, blooming year after year. The next morning, it wasn't the smell of roses that woke me. It was a deep, guttural rumble that vibrated through the floorboards, through the very bones of the house. I sat up in bed and knew, with a cold certainty that settled in my stomach like a stone, what it was. I didn't rush. I didn't panic. The time for that was long past. I walked to the kitchen, the linoleum cold under my bare feet, and put the coffee on, just like I did every morning. The machine gurgled to life, a familiar, comforting sound against the monstrous growl from outside. I watched the dark liquid drip into the pot, one slow drop at a time. Each drop felt like a second. I was stealing back. With my coffee in my favorite mug, the one Richard gave me with the chipped rim, I walked to the window. There it was. A huge yellow bulldozer, its metal claw poised over my garden like a vulture. A man in a hard hat was talking to another, pointing directly at the Queen Elizabeth roses, their pink petals so delicate against the morning light. They looked like they were gesturing at a patch of dirt, a problem to be cleared. Something inside me should have shattered. My heart should have been pounding, my hands shaking. But they weren't. I was perfectly calm. I drank my coffee, the warmth spreading through my chest, a small, controlled fire against the ice in my veins. I finished the last drop, placed the mug gently in the sink, and walked to the old oak desk in the living room. From the bottom drawer, I pulled out a small, thin folder. It was made of simple manila cardboard, held together by a faded blue ribbon. It didn't look like much. It didn't look like a weapon. I walked to the front door, opened it, and stepped onto the porch. The air was cool and smelled of diesel fumes, a foul perfume choking the scent of the roses. The foreman saw me. He was a big man, with a confident, dismissive smile already forming on his lips. He probably saw a frail old woman in a nightgown, an easy problem to handle. "Good morning," I said. My voice was even, quiet. It didn't even tremble. He tipped his hard hat. "Morning, ma'am. We'll try to be out of your hair as quick as we can. Just clearing this little patch here." "You can't work here," I said, not as a plea, but as a statement of fact. His smile widened, turning condescending. He had dealt with emotional old ladies before. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we have a work order, all signed and proper from the owner of the house." He patted the side of the porch railing. "This big, beautiful $750,000 house." "I know," I said, and my fingers untied the blue ribbon on the folder. "And the owner of the land this house stands on is standing right in front of you." His smile faltered. He stared at the document I held out, a single piece of thick, notarized paper. He couldn't have understood the legal language, but he understood the raised seal. He understood the look on my face. And he understood that his big, yellow machine had suddenly stopped being the most powerful thing in the yard. All I could think about, watching the confusion cloud his face, was how it had all come to this. It had started the day before, with a conversation that felt more like a verdict. Simon had come over in the afternoon. He was driving his new car, a sleek, black thing that looked like it belonged in a movie. It was too big for the driveway, and he'd parked it awkwardly on the street. He found me in the garden, on my knees, gently weeding around the base of the rose bushes. My hands were covered in dirt. I remember the feeling of the rich, dark soil under my fingernails. It felt like life. "Mom," he'd said, his voice bright and breezy. He was wearing a new watch, a silver one that caught the sun and flashed in my eyes. He didn't offer to help. He never did. He stood on the perfectly manicured lawn, careful not to get his expensive shoes dirty. "Hello, Simon," I said, looking up at him. He was his father's son, tall and handsome, but he didn't have Richard's eyes. Richard's eyes were kind. Simon's were calculating. They were always measuring, assessing value. "The car is great, isn't it?" he said, gesturing back towards the street. "Bit of a pain to park, though. We've been talking, Tiffany and I." "We," he said, not I. It was always we. Tiffany, his wife, who had redecorated the house he grew up in with cold, gray furniture and sharp, metallic art. The house Richard and I had filled with warm wood and soft colors. The house I gave them. "We've decided," he announced, his voice full of the unshakable confidence of someone who has never been told no. He walked over to the edge of the garden, my garden, and pointed with one of those clean, unsoiled hands. "This is where the parking for my new car will go. We'll pave it over. It'll be much more practical." He was pointing at the memorial roses, the ones we planted for his father. He said it so casually, as if he were talking about removing a dead shrub, not erasing the last living piece of his father's legacy. He looked at them not as a living memory, but as an inconvenience, wasted space. I stayed on my knees, my hands frozen in the dirt. I could feel the sun on my back, but a chill was creeping through me. I looked at the rose bush. I remembered the day Richard and I bought it. He'd haggled with the man at the nursery, laughing, his voice a warm, deep rumble. He dug the hole himself, his back strong and sure. I remembered how he held my hand, his calloused fingers intertwined with mine, as we gently placed the roots into the earth. "For us, Evie," he'd said, "something that will still be beautiful long after we're gone." And now my son, his son, wanted to replace it with asphalt. "Mom," Simon said, a touch of impatience in his voice, "you have to be practical. Flowers die. A parking spot is an asset. It increases the property value." Property value. That's what it came down to. He wasn't just my son anymore. He was a property manager. And I, and my memories, were just sentimental clutter that needed to be cleared out. I slowly pulled my hands from the soil and rose to my feet, brushing the dirt from my knees. I looked at my son, my boy. I looked for a flicker of recognition, of shared memory in his eyes. There was none. There was only the bright, hard shine of his own ambition. He wasn't being cruel, not in his mind. He was just being efficient, and that was so much worse. I didn't argue. I didn't cry or beg. All the fight had gone out of me in that one cold moment. It was replaced by something else. Something hard and clear. Resolve. "I heard you, Simon," I said. My voice was very low. He took it as agreement. He smiled, relieved. The unpleasantness was over. "Great. I'll get a crew out here tomorrow morning. They'll be quick. You won't even notice." He noticed my silence then, but he misinterpreted it. He thought it was sadness. He placed a hand on my shoulder. A brief, awkward gesture. "It's for the best, Mom. You'll see." Then he turned and walked back to his big, shiny car, leaving me alone with the scent of the roses and the cold, hard lump of betrayal in my chest. I stood there for a long time, watching the dust settle where his car had been. The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, the same colors as the petals at my feet. And in that moment, standing in the quiet of my garden, another memory came to me, as clear as day. It was Richard, years ago, sitting right here at this kitchen table. We were signing papers with our lawyer, Mr. Thornton. a kind man with gentle eyes. It was the papers for the house. We were putting it in Simon's name for when he married, a wedding gift. The house is for the boy, Evie, Richard had said to me later that night, taking my hands in his. A good start in life, but the ground it stands on, that's for you, always. He had insisted on it. We set up the deed so that the house, the physical structure, was separate from the land itself. The land, this patch of earth that held our memories, remained mine, just in case, he'd whispered, kissing my forehead. A man should always make sure his queen has her own kingdom. I had forgotten about that. In the fog of grief after he passed, and in the years of trying to be a good, unobtrusive mother, I had tucked that memory away. Simon certainly never knew. He inherited the house, the grand $750,000 structure, and never once thought to ask about the foundation it was built upon. He was too busy looking at the shiny surfaces to ever consider what lay beneath. He wanted to be practical. I would show him practical. I walked inside, the screen door shutting softly behind me. The house felt alien, no longer my home but a property he managed. I sat down at this very table, my hands resting on the cool wood. They were not shaking anymore. My mind was a calm, quiet lake. I picked up the phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in over a decade. A receptionist answered. "Mr. Thornton, please," I said. There was a pause. Then the familiar, slightly older voice of the man who had helped us build our life. "Evelyn, is that you? Is everything all right?" "Everything is fine, Arthur," I said, and my voice was steady as a rock. "I need you to be here tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock sharp. Yes, it's about the land." Richard was always thinking ahead, wasn't he? The foreman's face was a perfect picture of disbelief, his jaw slack, his confident posture deflating like a punctured tire. He looked from the deed in my hand to the massive machine behind him, and for the first time, he seemed to see it for what it was, a trespasser. But my mind wasn't on him. It was on the moments that led to this one, the quiet hours of the night when I had laid the final bricks of my plan. After my call with Arthur Thornton, I hung up the phone. The house was silent, except for the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, a sound that had measured out my life for 50 years. It ticked through my wedding night, through Simon's first steps, through the terrible silence after Richard's funeral. Now it was ticking down the seconds to a war I never wanted, but which I was fully prepared to win. There was no rage left in me. It had burned out the moment Simon had pointed at his father's roses and called them impractical. What remained was a cold, clear purpose. I walked through the house, my house, no, his house, on my land. I touched the gray, textured wallpaper Tiffany had insisted on, the kind that felt like sandpaper. I ran my hand over the sharp glass coffee table that had replaced our old oak one. They had systematically stripped away every trace of the life Richard and I had built here, redecorating it into a showroom for their own success. They had taken the warmth, the history, the very soul of the place, and I had let them. I had watched them do it, biting my tongue, telling myself it was their home now, their life. I had retreated into my garden, my last remaining sanctuary. And now he was coming for that too, for a place to park his car. I could picture him so clearly, making the call to the construction company. He'd have been leaning back in his expensive office chair, phone tucked between his ear and shoulder, while he typed an email with one hand. His voice would have been casual, efficient. "Yeah, my mother's place. Just clear out that old garden on the side. Pave it over. Send me the bill." He wouldn't have given it a second thought. It was just an item on a to-do list, a problem to be solved with money. He would have felt a small, satisfying surge of accomplishment, the feeling of a man who gets things done, a practical man. He had no idea he was signing his own eviction notice. I didn't sleep in the guest room they had assigned to me in my own home. I went to the attic. It was the one place they hadn't touched. It still smelled of cedar and old paper. I pulled the string for the single bare bulb, and the light cast long shadows over a lifetime of forgotten things. In a corner, under a dusty sheet, was Richard's old armchair. The leather was cracked and worn, but I could still see the shape of him in it. I sat there, in the quiet dark, and I didn't cry. I remembered. I remembered Richard's hands, how they were strong enough to build the porch we were sitting on, yet gentle enough to tend the most delicate rosebud. He believed in foundations. "Everything needs a strong foundation, Evie," he used to say, whether he was talking about a house, a marriage, or a child. When we gave the house to Simon, he saw something in our son that I, in my motherly love, had refused to see. He saw a boy who loved the view from the top of the wall but never bothered to check the strength of the bricks. That's why he had insisted on the land. It wasn't a trick. It was a failsafe, a final act of protection for me, from the one person he never thought I'd need protecting from. Sitting there in his chair, I felt his presence so strongly, it was as if he were in the room with me, his hand on my shoulder, whispering, "You know what to do, Evie. Be practical." I must have fallen asleep, because I woke up to the first pale light of dawn filtering through the dusty attic window. My back was stiff, but my mind was sharp. I went downstairs. The house was still. Simon and Tiffany were probably sleeping soundly in the master bedroom, the room Richard and I had shared for 40 years. They were probably dreaming of new cars and rising property values. That's when the rumble started. The sound of the bulldozer. It was earlier than I expected. They were eager to get the job done. I followed my routine. Coffee, the same chipped mug, but this time, as I stood by the kitchen window watching the yellow monster position itself, I wasn't just a sad old woman. I was a general observing the enemy's advance, confident in the strategy I had laid out the night before. I knew every move that was about to be made. The call I'd made to Arthur Thornton had been brief. It was a conversation between two people who understood each other perfectly, without needing to fill in the emotional details. Arthur Thornton's office, a young, professional voice, had answered. "It's Evelyn Miller for him," I'd said. There was a click, and then Arthur's voice, warmer and deeper than the receptionist's, but with the same familiar weariness of a man who had seen too much of human nature. "Evelyn, goodness, it's been a while. Is everything all right?" "Everything is about to be, Arthur," I said calmly. "I need you, not right this second, but tomorrow morning. I need you to be ready." I could hear the rustle of papers on his end, the sound of him giving me his full attention. "Ready for what?" "Tomorrow morning, a bulldozer is scheduled to arrive at my home, or rather, at my son's home. It is going to attempt to demolish my rose garden." I paused, letting the words sink in. "The garden my late husband and I planted." There was a heavy silence on the other end of the line. Arthur knew Simon. He'd known him since he was a boy who chased frogs in the very garden that was now under threat. He didn't say, "Oh, how could he?" or, "That's terrible." He was a lawyer. He dealt in facts, not feelings. "I see," he said, and his voice had turned from warm to steel. "And what would you like me to do?" "I want you to have the original deed to the land ready, the one that separates the plot from the structure itself. I have my copy here, but I want you, my legal counsel, to have the official document on hand. When I call you tomorrow, I need you to come here immediately. Do not speak to my son. Do not speak to his wife. Just come." I understand completely, Evelyn, he said. There was no hesitation, no more questions. He was the keeper of Richard's final wish, and he understood his duty. I'll have the file on my desk. Just call. Thank you, Arthur, I said. No, Evelyn, he replied, his voice softening just a little. Thank Richard. He was a very wise man. We hung up, and that was it. The weapon was loaded, the mechanism was in place. All that was left was for the enemy to walk into the trap. So as I stood on the porch, holding my simple manila folder, looking at the foreman whose arrogance was rapidly turning to fear, I felt no triumph, only a deep, profound sadness. A sadness that Richard's foresight had been necessary. A sadness that my son had become a man who would send a machine to dig up his own father's heart. The foreman cleared his throat, his eyes darting between me and the paper. Look, ma'am, I don't know anything about this. I just have a work order. I understand that, I said, my voice still quiet. And I'm telling you that your work order is invalid. You are currently trespassing on my property. Your client, Simon Miller, has contracted you to destroy private property on land he does not own. I suggest you turn off that engine and call your boss. And then I suggest you call your company's lawyer. I folded the paper and slipped it back into the folder. I didn't need to show it to him any longer. The seed of doubt had been planted, and it was growing into a tree of legal complications right before his eyes. He pulled out his phone, his big, clumsy fingers fumbling with the screen. He turned his back to me, already speaking in a low, urgent tone. I didn't need to hear the words. I knew what was happening. The first gear in a great, expensive machine was grinding to a halt. I turned and walked back inside, leaving him to his frantic phone calls. I went to the kitchen and took my phone from the counter. My hand was perfectly steady as I found Arthur's number in my contacts and pressed the screen. It rang once. Thornton, he answered, his voice crisp and ready. Arthur, I said, the bulldozer has arrived. It's time. I hung up the phone with Arthur, and the quiet satisfaction I felt was as profound as the silence in the house. The battle wasn't over, but the decisive blow had been struck. Now, I just had to wait for the shock wave to reach its target. It didn't take long. Through the window, I saw the foreman end his call, his face pale. He shouted something to the man in the bulldozer's cab, and the deep rumble of the engine died, replaced by an unnerving quiet. The birds, which had been silenced by the noise, cautiously began to sing again. It was as if the garden itself was breathing a sigh of relief. The foreman looked towards the house one last time, a look of pure bewilderment on his face. Then he started making another call. This one, I knew, was to my son. I took the time to make a pot of tea, Earl Grey. The scent of bergamot filled the kitchen, a civilized aroma that felt like a shield against the ugliness outside. I poured the steaming liquid into a delicate china cup, one of the few things of my own that Tiffany hadn't packed away into a box labeled attic junk. I carried my tea to the living room and sat in a hard, uncomfortable chair that faced the front door, and I waited. Less than 15 minutes later, Simon's sleek black car screeched to a halt in the driveway, kicking up gravel. He burst out of the car before the engine was even fully off. He didn't just walk to the door, he stormed it. The front door flew open, slamming against the wall with a crack that made me flinch. "What is the meaning of this?" he yelled. His face was flushed, his expensive suit jacket askew. He looked like a spoiled child whose favorite toy had just been taken away. "I just got off the phone with the contractor. He's talking about lawsuits, trespassing. Mom, what circus are you pulling? He was standing in the foyer, breathing heavily, radiating fury. He hadn't lowered his voice. He was treating me like a senile old woman who had wandered off and caused a scene. "This is my house," he bellowed, his voice echoing in the high-ceilinged hall he had been so proud of renovating. "You can't just stop things. I own this house." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my tea. The cup was steady in my hand. I looked at him over the rim, my expression calm. "No, Simon," I said, my voice quiet but carrying clearly in the tense silence. "You own the house. You do not own the land it is built on. There is a very important legal distinction." He stared at me as if I'd started speaking in a foreign language. The concept was so alien to him, so far outside the realm of his understanding, that he couldn't process it. He thought it was a trick, a pathetic attempt to guilt him. "The land? What are you talking about? It's the same thing," he sputtered, taking a step towards me. "Are you losing your mind? Did you forget that Dad and you gave me this house?" "Your father was a very thorough man," I replied, placing my teacup gently on its saucer. The small click was the only sound in the room. "He gave you a roof over your head. He left me the ground beneath your feet." Just as the rage was beginning to build in his eyes again, just as he was about to unleash another torrent of angry, dismissive words, a second car pulled into the driveway. It was a modest, dark blue sedan, and it parked neatly behind Simon's ostentatious vehicle. It didn't screech. It came to a soft, respectful stop. The driver's door opened, and Mr. Arthur Thornton stepped out. He was exactly as I remembered him, only older. His hair was completely white now, and he moved a little more slowly, but he still wore the same impeccably tailored gray suit and carried the same worn leather briefcase. He radiated an aura of quiet, unshakable authority. Simon's tirade died in his throat. He watched, confused, as this old man walked calmly up the porch steps. Arthur didn't even glance at my son. His eyes met mine through the open doorway, and he gave me a small, reassuring nod. Then he turned his attention to the foreman, who was standing awkwardly by his pickup truck, looking like he wished the earth would swallow him whole. Arthur walked directly to him. "Good morning," he said, his voice the calm, measured tone of a man who has commanded courtrooms for 40 years. "I am Arthur Thornton. I represent the owner of this parcel of land, Mrs. Evelyn Miller." He opened his briefcase and took out a thick, official-looking document for the original deed. He didn't show it to the foreman. He just held it. Its presence was enough. "My client has already informed you that you are trespassing," Arthur continued, his voice calm but laced with iron. "I am here to make the legal position unequivocally clear. Your equipment is currently on private property without the owner's consent. If that machine," he gestured with his free hand towards the silent bulldozer, "so much as scratches the dirt or damages a single rose bush, we will file a civil suit against your company for willful destruction of property. Given the documented sentimental and historical value of the items in question, we will be seeking damages in the 6-figure range. Are we understood?" The foreman, who had been intimidated by me, was utterly terrified of Arthur. He was nodding vigorously, his eyes wide. "Yes, sir. Perfectly, sir. We won't touch a thing. We're leaving." "A wise decision," Arthur said. Then finally, he turned to face my son. Simon had watched the entire exchange with a dawning horror on his face. The anger had evaporated, replaced by a chilling confusion, and then a sickening understanding. He was no longer dealing with his sentimental old mother. He was being confronted by the cold, hard face of the law, a world where his charm and his money meant nothing against a signed and sealed document. This wasn't a family spat anymore. This was a legal proceeding. "Mr. Thornton," Simon said, his voice barely a whisper. He looked from Arthur to me and back again. The pieces were clicking into place in his mind, forming a picture he did not want to see. "What is this? Mom, what have you done?" "What your father and I did, Simon," I said, finally rising from my chair, "was provide for you. But your father also provided for me. He foresaw a day when practicalities might overshadow promises." Arthur stepped forward, positioning himself subtly between me and Simon. He addressed my son directly, but his tone was no longer that of a friendly family lawyer. It was formal, detached. "Simon," he said, "the legal situation is quite simple. In 1998, your parents gifted you the structure located at this address, the house itself, as a wedding present. However, the deed for the land, Lot 7B of the county subdivision, was retained by your mother, Evelyn Miller. She is, and always has been, the sole legal owner of this property. Your house is, in effect, a permanent guest on her land." Simon's face was ashen. He looked like he'd been punched in the gut. He leaned against the door frame for support. The $750,000 house he was so proud of, his greatest asset, the symbol of his success, it was built on a foundation of sand. No, worse. It was built on a foundation he didn't own. "A guest?" he repeated, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "What does that even mean?" "It means," Arthur said, his voice devoid of any sympathy, "that you have no legal right to alter the land in any way. You cannot build a parking lot. You cannot remove a tree. You cannot, in fact, even hammer a sign into the lawn without the express written permission of the landowner. To do so is a breach of her property rights." He paused, letting the weight of the words settle. "Frankly, your attempt to do so this morning with a bulldozer was monumentally ill-advised." Suddenly, Tiffany appeared at the top of the stairs, wrapped in a silk robe, her face a mask of annoyance. "Simon, what is all this shouting? You woke me up." She started down the stairs, but stopped halfway when she saw the scene in the foyer. Her husband, pale and defeated, me, standing calm and composed, and a strange, imposing man in a suit holding a legal document. "What's going on?" she demanded, her gaze falling on me with suspicion. "What did she do?" Simon didn't answer. He couldn't. He just stared at the deed in Arthur's hand as if it were a snake. He was finally understanding the full scope of his miscalculation. He had seen my roses as a worthless patch of weeds and my love as something he could pave over. He had mistaken my silence for weakness, my grief for senility. He thought he was the king of this castle, but he had forgotten to check who owned the kingdom. And now, the true queen was standing right in front of him, with her lawyer at her side, and all the power he thought he had was turning to dust. The look on his face wasn't anger anymore. It was fear. Pure, unadulterated fear. The silence that followed Arthur's words was more profound than the roar of any bulldozer. It was a vacuum, sucking all the air and anger out of the room. Tiffany stood frozen on the staircase, her hand gripping the banister, her knuckles white. Her mind, I could see, was working furiously, trying to translate the legalese into the language she understood: money, status, and security. Simon just stared, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. The brilliant, confident man who had planned my garden's destruction was gone. In his place was a lost little boy who had just learned the world was not built the way he thought it was. He looked at me, his eyes pleading, searching for a sign that this was some elaborate, cruel joke. He found none. It was Tiffany who broke the spell. "Wait," she said, her voice sharp, cutting through the heavy silence. "What does he mean, guest on her land? Simon, what does that mean for us? Us, not our family, not your mother, us, the two of them in their fortress of glass and steel." Simon couldn't answer. He just shook his head, a gesture of pure, helpless denial. Arthur Thornton, ever the professional, answered for him. "It means, Mrs. Miller," he said, his tone polite but firm, "that your right to inhabit this house is contingent on the landowner's permission. Legally, she could begin eviction proceedings at any time." Tiffany's carefully constructed composure shattered. "Eviction?" The word came out as a strangled gasp. She looked around at her perfectly decorated living room, at the expensive art on the walls, at the life she had built. "She can't evict us. This is our house. We've poured hundreds of thousands of dollars into this place." "You've improved a structure on someone else's property," Arthur corrected gently. "A risky investment, in hindsight." The sound of an engine starting outside made us all turn. The foreman, seeing his opportunity to escape the crossfire of this bizarre family war, was getting out. The bulldozer coughed to life, not with its earlier aggressive roar, but with a tired, sputtering groan. It began to reverse, its tracks churning the edge of the lawn, leaving muddy scars in the perfect grass Simon was so proud of. The machine lumbered away, a defeated beast retreating from a battle it had no business being in. The foreman gave a final, apologetic wave and drove his truck away, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. Simon's power, his practicality, had literally just driven down the street. When it was gone, the quiet that returned was different. It was heavy with unspoken things, thick with the ruins of a family. I turned and walked back through the open front door, letting the screen door close softly behind me. I didn't go into the house. I walked off the porch and onto the grass, towards the roses. They stood untouched, their petals shimmering in the morning sun, oblivious to the war that had been waged over them. I reached out and gently touched a bloom on the Queen Elizabeth bush, its soft pink a stark contrast to the ugliness of the morning. Its familiar sweet scent filled my lungs. This was real. This was what mattered. I heard footsteps behind me. It was Arthur, his briefcase in hand. He came to stand beside me, a silent, supportive presence. Then, more hesitant steps. "Simon." He stopped a few feet away, looking not at me, but at the roses, as if seeing them for the first time. He saw what his father had planted. He saw what he had tried to destroy. Tiffany remained on the porch, a furious, impotent statue. She wouldn't set foot on the grass. It was no longer her territory. "Mom," Simon began, his voice raspy, broken. "Mom, I didn't understand." "No," I said, my voice as calm and steady as the morning air. "You didn't. You saw these as an inconvenience. You saw my memories as clutter. You saw this land as something to be paved over for your convenience." I turned to face him fully. The sun was behind me, and I could see him squinting. He looked small. "You didn't just forget who owned this land, Simon. You forgot who you were. You forgot whose son you are." He flinched, as if I had struck him. "That's not fair," he whispered. "We're family. You can't just do this to your own family." There it was, the appeal to emotion, the final, desperate card of a man who had no others left to play. It might have worked yesterday. It might have worked a week ago, but it wouldn't work today. I felt a wall of ice form around my heart, a shield forged in the fires of his betrayal. "You are the one who did this, Simon," I said, my voice level, betraying none of the deep, aching sadness I felt. "When you decided that a parking spot was more important than your father's memory, you redefined our relationship. You turned it into a business transaction. So, let's treat it as one." I looked at Arthur. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He had the deed in his hand, my scepter. "As I see it," I continued, turning my gaze back to my son, "we have two options moving forward. You need to listen very carefully." Simon stood frozen, his face a mask of dread. He knew a verdict was coming. "Option 1, I said, holding up a single finger. "You and Tiffany will sign a quitclaim deed, transferring ownership of the house, the structure, back to me, effective immediately. The $750,000 asset will be mine. In return, I will draft a rental agreement. You can continue to live here as my tenants. You will pay a fair market rent every month. You will not alter the property, inside or out, without my written permission. The garden will, of course, remain untouched. You will live here under my rules." The blood drained from his face. To become a renter in his own home, the humiliation of it was a physical blow. Tiffany, from the porch, let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. "Or," I said, my voice dropping slightly, "there is option 2. I paused, letting the silence stretch, letting him contemplate the abyss. "I can choose not to have you as tenants. Mr. Thornton will file an action for ejectment on the grounds that your presence on my land is no longer welcome due to your hostile actions against my property. A judge will grant it without a second thought. You will have 30 days to vacate the premises. The house will become mine by default, as it cannot be moved. You will leave with nothing but the contents. You will lose the house, the money you've invested in it, everything." I stopped speaking. The ultimatum hung in the air between us, shimmering and deadly. I had laid out his future on a platter, a future of complete and utter subjugation, or a future of absolute ruin. "Choose, Simon," I said quietly. He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. His mind, so quick and calculating when it came to business deals, had completely stalled. He looked to Tiffany for help, but she was just as stunned, her face a mixture of rage and panic. This wasn't supposed to happen. Old mothers were supposed to be sentimental and weak. They weren't supposed to hold all the cards. You wouldn't," he finally managed to stammer. "You wouldn't kick your own son out onto the street, your own grandchildren." He was using his children now. The children he and Tiffany were often too busy to spend time with, leaving them with nannies. The children I took to the park and baked cookies for. "Your children are always welcome here," I said, the ice in my voice cracking just for a moment. "This will always be their grandmother's home. The question is whether it will also be their parents' home, and that depends entirely on you." I took a step closer. "You sent a machine here this morning to tear out the last piece of your father I have left. You did that to me, your mother. Don't you dare talk to me about what a parent would or wouldn't do. You showed me exactly what a son would do." He finally broke. His shoulders slumped in utter defeat. The fight was gone. The arrogance was gone. All that was left was the wreckage. "The first option," he mumbled, his eyes fixed on the ground. We'll sign the house over." Beside me, Arthur Thornton spoke, his voice sealing the deal. "I can have the necessary documents drafted and delivered by messenger this afternoon, Simon. I suggest you and your wife have your attorney review them, though I assure you they will be perfectly straightforward. You'll need to sign them by tomorrow at noon. His presence was a constant, crushing reminder that this was not a negotiation. It was the terms of surrender. I gave a final nod. It was done. I felt no joy, no triumphant glee, just the heavy, somber satisfaction of justice served. I had saved the roses. I had protected Richard's memory. But in doing so, I had to detonate the foundations of my own family. I turned my back on my son and his wife. I left them standing in the shadow of the house that was no longer theirs, facing the ruin of their own making. I walked back to the rose bushes, my true home. I reached down and pulled a tiny weed from the soil near the roots of a deep red rose, a Mr. Lincoln. My hands were steady. The sun was warm on my back. The garden was safe. And I was, for the first time in a very long time, completely and utterly alone. The papers arrived that afternoon, just as Arthur had promised. A stoic courier in a crisp uniform handed a thick envelope to Tiffany at the door. I watched from the kitchen window as she took it, her hand trembling slightly. She didn't look at me. In fact, for the rest of the day, both she and Simon moved through the house like ghosts, their voices reduced to hushed, frantic whispers behind the closed door of the master bedroom. The next morning, at 11:30 minutes before the deadline, Simon knocked softly on my door, the guest room door. I opened it. He stood there, holding the signed and notarized documents. He didn't look at me. His eyes were fixed on a spot on the carpet. His face was gaunt, the confident swagger he always carried replaced by a weary stoop. He had aged a decade overnight. "Here," he said, holding the papers out to me. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. It was the voice of a man signing a confession. I took the envelope from his hand. Our fingers brushed for a moment, and I felt a pang of something cold and hollow in my chest. This was my son, my little boy, who used to bring me fistfuls of dandelions from this very garden, calling them golden treasures. Now he was handing me the deed to his ruin. "Thank you, Simon," I said. My voice was gentle. There was no need for any more cruelty. The war was over. Mr. Thornton will file these with the county clerk's office this afternoon. It will be official by the end of the day. He just nodded, unable to speak, and turned and walked away. I closed my door and sat on the edge of the bed, the heavy envelope in my lap. I didn't feel victorious. I just felt tired and profoundly sad. This wasn't how a mother should feel. This wasn't a victory to celebrate. It was a tragedy that had been narrowly averted, leaving wreckage in its wake. For the first few weeks, the house was suffocating. The air was thick with resentment. Simon and Tiffany were meticulously polite, their words clipped and formal. "Good morning." "Excuse me, dinner is ready." They were strangers in their own home, and I was the warden. Tiffany spent most of her time on the phone, her voice a low, angry murmur as she presumably explained their sudden, catastrophic change in fortune to her friends. Simon left early for work and came back late, his face a constant mask of stress. He was a tenant now, and the first of the month was a new, excruciating ritual. He would slide an envelope with a check under my door. He never handed it to me directly. It was a transaction of shame, and the rustle of paper under the door was the only sound that passed between us. But while the house was a prison of silent bitterness, the garden became my sanctuary, my freedom. The moment I stepped outside, the tension in my shoulders would melt away. The roses, my faithful sentinels, had stood their ground. They had won, and now it was time to honor them. I knew I couldn't just leave things as they were. The garden couldn't remain just a symbol of a battle fought. It had to become a symbol of a life being rebuilt. It had to be more than just Richard's memorial. It had to become my future. A week after the deed was filed, I made a call. Not to a lawyer, but to a woman whose name I'd gotten from a local nursery. Her name was Isabella, and she was a landscape architect. When she arrived, she wasn't what I expected. She was young, with dirt under her fingernails and a bright, infectious laugh. She walked into my garden, and her eyes lit up. "Oh," she breathed, her gaze falling on the old, gnarled bushes Richard and I had planted. "They have stories, don't they?" She understood immediately. I didn't have to explain the whole sordid affair. I just told her, "This garden is the most important thing in the world to me. It was almost destroyed. Now I want to make it indestructible. I want to make it bigger. I want to make it a paradise." We spent hours walking through the yard, Isabella with her sketchbook and I with my memories. I showed her the spot where Richard had built a small stone bench, which Tiffany had thrown out because it was rustic. I told her about the climbing roses he had wanted to plant along the side of the house. I told her about his dream of a small pond, a place for birds to drink. Isabella didn't just listen. She absorbed. She sketched furiously, her pencil flying across the page. "We won't just restore it," she said, her eyes shining with vision. "We'll resurrect it. The old roses, the ones your husband planted, they will be the heart, and we will build a whole new body around them." The work began a week later. A new crew of men arrived, but these men came with shovels and saplings, not bulldozers. They came to create, not to destroy. I would sit on the porch for hours, a cup of tea in my hand, and watch them work under Isabella's cheerful direction. They laid a winding flagstone path. They rebuilt the stone bench better than before. They installed a small bubbling fountain that filled the air with the gentle sound of running water. And the flowers. Oh, the flowers. We planted everything. Lavender and sage, their scents mingling with the roses. Tall, proud delphiniums in shades of blue and purple. Cheerful black-eyed Susans and elegant white hydrangeas. The garden began to expand, creeping along the side of the house, surrounding the property in a riot of color and life. Simon and Tiffany watched from the windows. I could feel their eyes on me. Every new plant, every stone laid, was a testament to their defeat. The garden, the thing he had dismissed as impractical, was flourishing, becoming more beautiful and more valuable with each passing day. It was a living, breathing monument to his catastrophic misjudgment. One afternoon, I was on my knees, my hands deep in the rich, dark soil, planting new bulbs for the spring tulips, when Simon came home from work. He stopped at the edge of the new path, his briefcase in his hand. He watched me for a long moment. The landscapers had gone for the day, and it was just the two of us, separated by a sea of flowers. "It's beautiful, Mom," he said. His voice was quiet, hesitant. It was the first time he had spoken to me about anything other than household logistics in over a month. I looked up, shielding my eyes from the sunday. "Your father would have loved it," I said simply, and returned to my work. I wasn't ready to absolve him. The wound was still too deep. But it was a start. The real change came with the grandchildren. They were too young to understand the deeds and the lawyers. All they knew was that Grandma's yard, which had always been a nice place with some flowers, was now a magical wonderland. They would run down the new stone paths, hide behind the big hydrangea bushes, and dip their fingers in the cool water of the fountain. One Saturday, my grandson, Leo, who was only 6, came to me with a single perfect red rose he had picked. He had been told never to pick the flowers, and his face was a mixture of guilt and excitement. "This is for you, Grandma," he whispered, holding it out to me. "It's the prettiest one." I took the rose from his small hand. It was from the Mr. Lincoln bush, the very heart of the old garden. I looked at his innocent face, a face that held echoes of both his father and his grandfather. And in that moment, the last of the ice around my heart finally melted. The garden wasn't about victory anymore. It wasn't about punishing my son. It was about life. It was about creating a place of beauty and peace, a legacy for these children. It was about taking a place of pain and making it a place of joy. That evening, for the first time, I didn't wait for Simon to slide the rent check under my door. I went to the living room, where he and Tiffany were sitting in stiff silence, watching television. I held out the envelope from that morning, still sealed. "I don't want this," I said. They both stared at me, stunned. "This is not a business," I said. "This is a family, a broken one, but a family nonetheless. We are not landlord and tenants. We are a mother and a son living under the same roof. We have a lot to fix, and it doesn't start with a rent check." I placed the envelope on the glass coffee table. "But things will be different," I continued, my voice steady and strong. "This house will be a place of respect. Respect for me. Respect for your father's memory. And respect for this garden." I looked directly at Simon. "The roses stay. The garden stays. That is the rent you will pay from now on." He looked at me, and for the first time since that terrible morning, I saw a flicker of the boy I once knew in his eyes. I saw a glimmer of shame, of regret, and maybe, just maybe, a seed of hope. I didn't know if we could ever go back to what we were. Some things, once broken, can never be perfectly mended. But as I turned and walked back to my part of the house, I could hear the gentle sound of the fountain bubbling outside in my beautiful, thriving garden. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I had not just saved a few flowers, I had saved myself. I had found my ground, and I was finally, firmly, planting my own roots. The years that followed were quiet ones. The sharp edges of our family tragedy began to soften, worn down by the steady rhythm of seasons. The garden grew, becoming more lush and beautiful than I had ever dreamed. It became the true center of our home, the place where we all gathered. My grandchildren learned the names of every rose, their small hands surprisingly gentle as they helped me prune and weed. Simon and Tiffany never regained the sense of ownership they once had, and in some ways, it was a blessing. They became less like proprietors and more like custodians. They started treating the house with a newfound respect, as if they were guests in a place that held a history deeper than their own redecorations. Simon even started helping me in the garden. At first, it was awkward. He would pull weeds with a grim determination, his movements stiff, but slowly, I saw a change. I saw him pause to admire the deep crimson of a Mr. Lincoln rose. I saw him smile at the sight of a hummingbird hovering over the lavender. He was connecting with the soil, with the land, and in doing so, he was connecting with the memory of the father he had almost erased. Our relationship never fully healed. There was a scar, a permanent reminder of the wound. We were polite, we were kind, but the effortless trust a mother should have in her son was gone forever. I had seen a side of him I could never unsee, but we found a new way to be a family, a fragile piece cultivated as carefully as one of my prize-winning roses. But as I moved deeper into my 80s, I began to think about the future, not just for me, but for the garden. I had won the battle, but I hadn't yet won the war. The war was against time itself. What would happen to this place, this sanctuary, after I was gone? The thought that it could all be torn up and paved over by some future owner, someone with no connection to the love and pain embedded in its soil, was unbearable. Simon had learned his lesson, but I couldn't be certain that his children, or their children, would remember it. Memory is a fragile thing. So, one crisp autumn afternoon, I made another call to Arthur Thornton. His voice was much older now, thinner, but his mind was as sharp as ever. "Evelyn," he said, a warmth in his voice. "I trust the roses are still blooming." "More than ever, Arthur," I replied, "but it's the future blooms I'm calling about. I need to update my will." We met in his office, the same office where Richard and I had signed all those papers so many years ago. It was filled with the comforting smell of old books and leather. I told him my plan. He listened patiently, his fingertips steepled, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment. "You intend to disinherit your son completely?" he asked, his voice neutral. "Simon has his career," I said. "He is a successful man. He has his own money. What he lacks is not wealth, but legacy. And the legacy he tried to destroy is the one I must now protect." I leaned forward, my hands clasped on his desk. "This garden is more than just land, Arthur. It's a story. It's the story of my love for my husband. It's the story of a promise kept. I cannot entrust that story to a single person's memory. It needs a guardian, a permanent one." He nodded slowly, a look of profound understanding in his eyes. "And you have one in mind?" "The City Botanical Gardens," I said. "I've spoken with their director. They are enthusiastic." And they were. The director, a woman with the same passionate light in her eyes as my landscape architect Isabella, had walked through my garden with a sense of reverence. She saw it not just as a beautiful collection of plants, but as a living piece of history. Arthur drafted the new will. It was a masterpiece of legal precision. The house and the land, my entire estate, would be bequeathed not to my family, but to the Botanical Society. They would become the new owners, the new guardians, but my gift came with a condition, an ironclad covenant that would be attached to the deed forever. The covenant stated that the rose garden, the original plot that Richard and I had planted, must be preserved in perpetuity. It was to be named the Evelyn and Richard Miller Memorial Garden. It must be maintained, cared for, and kept open to the public, a quiet place for anyone to come and sit and reflect. My personal sanctuary would become a public treasure. I signed the will with a steady hand. Leaving Arthur's office, I felt a lightness I hadn't felt in years. The burden of being the sole protector was lifted. I had found a way to make my love for Richard, and the lesson Simon had learned, immortal. I did not tell Simon or Tiffany what I had done. There was no need. They would find out in due course. This wasn't an act of revenge. It was an act of preservation, my final, most practical act. My last years were peaceful. I spent most of my days in the garden, watching the seasons turn. I saw my grandchildren grow. I taught them how to tell a story through the language of flowers. I lived. When my time came, I passed peacefully in my own bed, in the guest room that had once been my cage but had become my comfortable nest. The window was open, and I could smell the sweet perfume of the night-blooming jasmine we had planted by the porch. The reading of the will was, I'm sure, a difficult day for my son. Arthur, loyal to the end, handled it himself. He told me later, when I saw him on the other side, that Simon had been silent, his face ashen as the terms were read. Tiffany had cried, not out of grief for me, but for the $750,000 house she had once again lost. But Simon, Arthur said, had a different look on his face. It wasn't anger. It was a look of deep, painful and final understanding. He had lost the house, he had lost the land, he had lost his inheritance, all because he had forgotten the one thing that truly mattered. A few months later, the Botanical Society took possession. They were true to their word. They loved and cared for the garden with a professional tenderness that would have made Richard proud. They installed a small, discreet bronze plaque near the stone bench, just as I had requested. It was nestled amongst the lavender, glinting in the Sunday. I see people there now, young couples holding hands, old men sitting quietly, lost in thought. Children like my own grandchildren once did, running down the stone paths, their laughter mixing with the sound of the fountain. They don't know me. They don't know the story of the bulldozer, or the deed, or the son who forgot his father's heart. All they know is that this is a beautiful, peaceful place. A place to breathe, a place to remember. My son told me I had to be practical. He wanted to replace my roses with a parking spot. So, I did the most practical thing I could think of. I reminded him that a house is worthless without the land it stands on, just as a family is worthless without the memories it's built on. He wanted to pave over my history. Instead, I turned it into a park, ensuring it would outlive us all. And now, my love story blooms forever, for everyone to see.